What would you do if the man who once saved your life asked you to ignore what you knew was wrong? A retired Navy SEAL faced that choice after finding a German shepherd mother shielding her puppy beside a frozen Idaho road. The dogs had not simply been abandoned. Their missing records led back to a veterans organization he had trusted for years. At its center stood his former commander, the man who had once refused to leave him behind. Now that same man believed a few frightened dogs were an acceptable price for saving everyone else. This is a story about loyalty, conscience, and the courage to stop following someone you still remember with gratitude. Tell us where you're watching from, share what choice you would make, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By late afternoon, the eastern slopes of the Sawtooth Valley had turned the color of old silver. Snow moved through the air in small, unhurried flakes, too gentle to resemble a storm and too steady to be ignored. It gathered along the shoulders of the mountain road, softened the dark pines, and covered the old guardrails until they looked less like metal than low white walls built to keep the valley's silence from spilling away. Mason Redfern drove with one gloved hand resting at the top of the steering wheel. His pickup was almost 20 years old, dark green beneath the road salt, with a heater that worked only when it felt respected. A toolbox rattled behind the seat whenever the truck crossed a patch of frozen gravel. On the passenger side floor sat a coil of cable, 2 replacement signal lamps, and the orange-handled insulated screwdriver Mason had carried through most of his civilian life. He had spent the day repairing an emergency beacon on the eastern ridge. The work had been simple in the way honest things were simple. Find the broken connection, strip the damaged wire, replace what could not be trusted. Test the signal until another human being, somewhere beyond the mountain, could hear it. Machines did not pretend their damage was wisdom. At 50, Mason still had the broad shoulders of the man he had once been, though his right shoulder sat slightly lower than his left. His olive-drab combat shirt fit close beneath an open work jacket, its camouflage sleeves faded at the elbows. Silver had begun to gather through his brown undercut, especially at the temples. A narrow scar crossed the outer edge of his left eyebrow, and his nose leaned faintly to one side from an old break that had never been important enough to repair. He looked like a man who could carry more than he should. For most of his life, people had mistaken that for the same thing as being unburdened. The road curved above Redfish Lake, which lay frozen below like a sheet of pale glass. Mason slowed near a winter-closed scenic overlook. The chain across the entrance sagged beneath the snow, but fresh tire tracks cut around it and crossed the empty parking area. He would have kept driving if the tracks had been the only unusual thing. Then he saw the blanket. It lay near the wooden railing, gray and partly buried, one corner lifting and falling in the wind. It did not belong there. Nothing else had been left behind. No coffee cup, no broken sled, no footprints from tourists trying to photograph the mountains. Mason pulled onto the shoulder and shut off the engine. The heater died with a tired cough. For a few seconds, he remained inside the cab, looking through the windshield. Old habits moved quietly through him. Vehicle tracks, no visible occupants, no movement near the tree line, no second set of footprints leading away. He disliked how easily his mind still arranged the world into threats and exits. "Just a blanket," he said. The empty truck offered no opinion. Mason stepped into the cold. Snow compressed beneath his waterproof boots. He wore no hat, and the air immediately found the silver at his temples. As he approached the overlook, the shape beneath the blanket shifted. A low sound rose from the snow. Not a bark, a warning. Mason stopped. The blanket lifted again, this time not from the wind. A German shepherd unfolded from beneath it, first the head, then the shoulders, Then the long, thin body of a female dog who had used herself as the final wall between winter and something smaller. Her coat was black and gold, though dirt and frost had dulled both colors. The black mantle across her back fell lower along the right side, uneven like a cloak fastened in haste. Her chest and legs were honey-colored. One ear stood upright. The other carried a small triangular notch near the outer edge and tilted slightly as she focused on him. Her legs trembled. Behind her, pressed into the shallow hollow beside the railing, lay a puppy. The little shepherd could not have been more than a few weeks old. His coat was lighter than the mother's, his paws absurdly large for his body. One ear stood as though determined to face the world. The other folded forward with less conviction. The mother stepped in front of him. She was not chained. That was what struck Mason first. She could have left. The woods were only 20 yards away. The road led downhill toward scattered cabins and the town beyond. But the puppy was too weak to cross the deep snow, and the mother had made her decision. She had stayed. Mason lowered his hands where she could see them. Easy. The dog's eyes fixed on his right hand, not his face, not his shoulders, his hand. Mason stopped speaking. He knew enough about frightened animals to understand that calm words were often more useful to the person saying them than to the creature hearing them. Slowly, he took out his phone. The mother stiffened at the movement, but did not advance. Mason turned slightly sideways, reducing the size of his silhouette, and called county dispatch. He reported the location, described the two dogs, and photographed the tire tracks without moving closer to the blanket. The dispatcher told him the road patrol expected heavier snowfall before dark. The county animal shelter was already over capacity, and the nearest available officer was more than an hour away. "Can you transport them safely?" the dispatcher asked. Mason looked at the mother. "No," he said, "but I may be able to transport them without making it worse." The dispatcher gave him the number for Dr. Elise Navarro's veterinary clinic in Stanley, and confirmed that the dogs would be placed under County Animal Control Authority once examined. Mason returned to the truck. He removed his field jacket and pulled a folded thermal emergency coat from the rear storage compartment. The bright material would have startled the dog, so he turned it inside out, hiding the reflective surface. Then he carried it halfway across the snow and laid it down. The mother watched every movement. Mason backed away until he stood near the truck. For a long time, nothing happened. The cold worked through his combat shirt. Snow collected along his hair and melted against the back of his neck. The puppy made a thin sound beneath the blanket, a small, uneven chirp that seemed too fragile to survive the open air. The mother turned her head. Only for a second. But that second revealed the exhaustion she had hidden from Mason. Her hind legs nearly folded. She steadied herself, touched her nose to the puppy's face, then looked back at the thermal coat. Mason realized she was not deciding whether to trust him. Trust was too large a thing to ask from an animal lying beside a road where a human had left her. She was choosing between dangers: the cold behind her, the stranger in front of her, and the small life trembling at her feet. The mother lowered her head, took the puppy gently by the loose skin near his shoulder, and dragged him onto the coat. Mason did not move. That restraint cost him more than action would have. For years, he had been trained to enter, secure, lift, carry, remove. Hesitation could kill people. Speed could save them. But this was not a battlefield, and the dog had not asked him to command it. She needed space in which to choose. When the puppy was fully on the coat, Mason approached one step at a time. The mother stood over him, her body shaking, lips drawn back without sound. Mason stopped close enough to reach the edge of the fabric. "I'm taking the coat," he said quietly. You can come with it." The mother stared at him. Then, with no surrender in the movement, she stepped onto the coat beside her puppy. Mason gathered the corners slowly and pulled the small bundle across the snow toward the truck. The mother walked on top of the fabric, keeping her body between Mason and the puppy, even while accepting his help. Inside the cab, Mason left the passenger door open. The puppy went first, wrapped loosely in the thermal coat and placed inside a shallow plastic equipment bin with the lid removed. The mother hesitated at the running board. Mason did not lift her. He climbed into the driver's seat and looked straight ahead. After nearly a minute, claws scraped metal. The dog climbed in by herself and crouched on the floor beside the puppy. Only then did Mason close the door. Dr. Elise Navarro's clinic occupied a low cedar building near the edge of Stanley. Its windows glowed warmly against the blue winter evening. Elise was waiting when Mason arrived. She was 48, compact and strong, with dark hair tied low at the back of her neck and a silver streak at her right temple. Her teal scrubs were partly covered by a gray fleece jacket. She did not rush toward the truck or brighten her voice into false cheerfulness. Instead, she opened the clinic door and said, "Bring the puppy. Leave the mother a clear path." Mason respected her immediately. The examination took nearly 2 hours. The puppy was cold, underfed, and dehydrated, but had no obvious fractures. The mother showed older pressure marks beneath her fur, especially near the shoulders and upper chest. She reacted sharply to the click of a kennel latch, turning sideways to place herself in front of the puppy. Elise stopped using the kennel. "That tells us something," she said. "What?" "That we shouldn't pretend we know everything yet." A scanner identified an old microchip beneath the mother's shoulder. The data loaded slowly on Elise's computer. The registered name was Ember. The former owner was listed as Valor Ridge Canine Recovery. The record had been archived more than a year earlier. No complete transfer destination appeared in the system. The puppy had no chip and no registration. He complained whenever Elise moved the food dish out of reach, producing a high, fluttering sound. Elise looked down at him. "He sounds like a finch trapped in a chimney." "No," Mason said. She glanced at him. "No what?" "No to the name." The puppy seized Mason's bootlace and pulled backward with all the confidence of a much larger animal. The lace slipped free. He rolled onto his back, paws in the air, staring at the ceiling as if gravity had committed a personal betrayal. Elise raised one eyebrow. "Finch," Mason said. "Fine." Brooke Sutter arrived near closing time carrying a dented metal clipboard and wearing a forest green county parka. At 55, she had a square, freckled face, short, ash-blonde hair, and the practical posture of someone who had spent years standing in bad weather while other people explained why rules should not apply to them. She reviewed the photographs, checked the incident number, and prepared a temporary foster authorization. "The shelter is full," Brooke explained. "The pass may close tonight, and neither animal should be transported farther than necessary. You're willing to keep them?" Mason looked through the clinic window. Ember lay beside Finch on a folded blanket. She was awake, watching the doorway. "For how long?" "Until ownership is verified or the county finds another placement." Mason had spent much of his adult life agreeing to assignments without asking how long they would last. This felt different. "All right." Brooke handed him the clipboard. "You'll record meals, medication, behavior changes, and every person who has contact with them." Mason looked at the 3 pages of instructions. "You people have forms for breathing?" "Only if someone does it incorrectly." His mouth shifted slightly at one corner. By the time they reached his house near Redfish Lake, night had covered the valley. The converted repair shop stood among tall pines, one half used for Mason's equipment and workbench, the other made into a spare, practical home with a wood stove, a narrow kitchen, and windows facing the frozen water. Ember entered last. Mason secured the transport crate door fully open with wire so it could not swing shut. He placed food near the wall, stepped away, and turned his back. He did not try to touch her. That first night, Ember remained between Finch and the front door. The second night, she ate while Mason stood across the room. By the third day, Finch had claimed one wool sock, 2 pieces of kindling, and an unused toothbrush that Mason had been certain was stored in a closed cabinet. Mason slept on the couch beside the stove. He told himself it was easier than walking back and forth from the bedroom whenever Finch cried. The explanation was technically true. Sometime after midnight, Mason woke to the soft ticking of cooling metal. The stove had burned low. Moonlight reflected from the frozen lake and spread across the floor in pale blue bands. Ember was asleep, not pretending, not listening with one eye open. Her head rested on her front paws. Finch lay on his back beside her, 4 feet pointed toward the ceiling, his small belly exposed to the whole dangerous world with outrageous confidence. Mason remained still. For months, the house had contained only the radio, the scrape of tools, and the occasional voice from county dispatch. It had been orderly, useful, and quiet enough that Mason never had to explain why he preferred it that way. Now a puppy snored near his boots. A wounded dog slept beside the door, and the silence no longer felt empty. Mason had brought 2 animals out of the snow. Lying awake in the blue light, he began to understand that the house might be carrying him out of another winter, one that had begun inside him when the orders stopped coming, and no one told him what kind of man he was supposed to become next. 4 days after Ember first slept with both eyes closed, the county posted a notice asking whether anyone recognized the 2 German shepherds found near the Redfish Lake overlook. Brooke Sutter had written it carefully. No address, no mention of Mason, no close photograph of Ember's face or the small triangular notch in her left ear. The notice listed only the date, the general area, the breed, and the fact that one dog was an adult female accompanied by a young male puppy. "Enough for a real owner to come forward," Brooke had said, "but not enough for every bored fool in Idaho to claim he once owned a black and tan dog." Mason had asked how often that happened. More often than people admit to lying on official forms. The notice bothered him anyway, not because he believed Ember and Finch belonged to him. The temporary foster authorization on his kitchen table made that distinction painfully clear. He was responsible for their meals, medication, safety, and records. Nothing more. But the idea of a stranger looking at the notice and deciding the dogs were property waiting to be collected made something tighten behind his ribs. He did not name the feeling. Naming things gave them shape, and shaped things had a habit of asking what a man intended to do about them. On the 4th morning, the sky above Stanley was bright and almost cloudless. The recent snowfall had covered the valley in clean white, while sunlight flashed from the drifts hard enough to make the eyes ache. Elise Navarro had recommended a short walk somewhere open. "Ember needs to see the world without every doorway becoming a trap," she had told Mason. "Give her space, let her choose distance, and do not turn it into training." "I know the difference." Elise had looked over the rim of her burgundy thermos. "You know the military definition of the difference?" Mason had decided not to argue with a veterinarian holding a syringe. The winter trail began near the edge of Stanley, where a small parking lot served cross-country skiers, snowshoers, and people who believed hot coffee tasted better after voluntarily making themselves cold. A cedar kiosk displayed avalanche notices and trail maps. Nearby, a narrow cafe window had been cut into the side of an old equipment shed. Steam rose from paper cups, while adult visitors stood in bright coats, talking softly beneath the pines. Mason wore his olive-drab combat shirt beneath a dark green parka. Ember walked in a loose, moss-colored Y harness, the lead hanging with enough slack that she could choose either side of him. She stayed mostly on his left. Not because he had taught her to heel. That was simply the side with fewer people. Finch wore a mustard-colored harness and moved through the snow as if every object had been placed there specifically for his investigation. He buried his nose in a drift, sneezed, accused the snow of misconduct, and then chased his own shadow across a patch of bright ground. The shadow proved faster. Finch responded by running in a circle until his back legs lost the argument with his front ones. Mason watched him roll onto his side. Excellent tactical assessment. Finch scrambled upright and attacked a pine cone. Ember glanced at Mason briefly, then back at the puppy. Her expression carried the solemn fatigue of a mother who had accepted that dignity might not be hereditary. They did not go far. The purpose was not distance. Mason let Ember pause whenever another dog appeared on the trail. She did not growl. Instead, she turned her body slightly, putting herself between Finch and whatever approached. If the other animal passed without interest, Ember relaxed one muscle at a time. Mason began to understand that fear did not always look like panic. Sometimes it looked like perfect attention. Sometimes it looked like a creature arranging itself, so no one else would have to be afraid first. By the time they returned toward the parking lot, Finch had collected a twig, lost it, found a longer twig, and appeared satisfied that the outing had produced measurable results. Then Ember stopped. The change was so immediate that Mason felt it through the lead before he saw the reason. Two men stood beside his truck. Neither looked dressed for a walk. The first was lean and narrow-faced, with a buzz cut beneath a faded cap. A black soft-shell jacket covered an olive hoodie, and his gray cargo pants were clean except for wet marks near the boots. He spun a set of keys around one index finger, stopped when Mason noticed, then slid them into his pocket. The second man was larger, taller than Mason by several inches, broad through the neck and shoulders, with a shaved head and a short black and gray beard cut sharply along the jaw. He wore a dark navy puffer jacket and stood to the right of the driver's door, not blocking it exactly, but close enough to control who reached it first. Mason had known men who chose their positions without thinking. He had also known men who always thought. The lean man offered a smile. "Mason Redfern?" Mason stopped 20 feet away. "You are?" "Curtis Hale." The man pointed with one thumb toward his companion. "That's Leon Pike. We've been looking for those dogs." Ember moved behind Mason, then changed her mind and stepped sideways in front of Finch. Curtis's eyes followed the motion. Not with relief. With calculation. "We saw the county notice," he continued. "Female shepherd, young male pup, redfish area. They belong to a private sporting dog kennel we work with." Mason did not shorten the leash. "What kennel?" Curtis reached inside his jacket slowly and removed a plastic folder. Leon watched Ember. "Granite Peak Sporting Dogs," Curtis said. "We have the ownership certificate, transport documentation, veterinary release. Whole thing was a contractor mistake. Someone left them at the wrong transfer point." "At the side of a mountain road?" Curtis's smile weakened. The driver panicked when the weather turned. The day was too bright for the lie. It stood between them without shelter. Curtis opened the folder and held out a page bearing a printed seal and several signatures. Mason did not reach for it. "Set it on the hood." A small irritation passed through Curtis's eyes, but he obeyed. Leon spoke for the first time. "You scan E14? His voice was low, flat, and almost casual. Mason looked at him. "What did you call her?" The female. Leon nodded at Ember. E14. Did you scan the chip? Neither man had asked whether the dogs were warm now. Neither had asked about the puppy's health, his appetite, or the days spent in the snow. They wanted to know what information had been found. Finch attempted to climb over Ember's front paw to inspect a scrap of blue paper frozen into the parking lot. Ember pushed him back gently with her shoulder. Curtis gave a quiet sigh, as though Mason were making a simple exchange unnecessarily difficult. "We appreciate that you helped them," he said. "Truly. We'll cover the clinic bill and your trouble. But this isn't complicated. You drove here without speaking to the county? We came to avoid wasting anyone's time." "Whose time?" Curtis's smile disappeared completely. Leon lifted his right hand. 2 fingers rose near his chest. Then his palm turned downward. The movement was small enough that another person might have missed it. Ember did not. Her body collapsed toward the snow, not in obedience, in memory. She lowered her chest, twisted sideways, and pressed Finch beneath the shelter of her neck. Her ears flattened. Every part of her became still except for the trembling that moved beneath the black mantle of her coat. She did not bark. She did not bare her teeth. The silence of her reaction carried more weight than aggression could have. Mason looked at Leon's hand. Leon lowered it. "What was that?" Mason asked. "Basic control signal. For a dog you say belongs to a sporting kennel?" Leon's jaw shifted. Working dogs learn all kinds of things. Mason felt the old part of himself rise. It did not arrive as anger. Anger was loud and easy to recognize. This was colder. The world narrowed around distance, hands, exits, and the precise amount of force required to move one man away from a truck door. He could cross the space before Leon finished turning. That knowledge had once kept people alive. Now it waited inside Mason like a tool he no longer trusted himself to carry casually. Ember's breathing came fast against the snow. Mason did not advance. He took out his phone. Curtis watched him. "Who are you calling?" "The person whose name is on the custody order. This doesn't require animal control. Then they should be able to resolve it quickly." Brooke answered on the second ring. Mason gave her the location and kept his description plain. 2 men claiming ownership, documents present. One identified the female by a number. A trained hand signal caused a severe fear response. Brooke told him not to surrender the animals or leave the location. Curtis heard enough to understand. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Mason slipped the phone back into his pocket. "No. I'm making it documented." For the next 20 minutes, they stood in a parking lot filled with ordinary winter life. Skis clicked against roof racks. The cafe window opened and closed. A woman in a red coat laughed at something her companion said. Steam drifted above the snow. The normality made the tension stranger. Curtis tried a softer approach first. He explained that paperwork could become confused during interstate transfers. He said Ember had been part of a selective breeding program and was worth a considerable amount of money. He offered to reimburse Mason immediately. When that failed, his tone changed. "You served, didn't you?" Mason looked at him without answering. Curtis glanced at the faded camouflage on Mason's sleeves. Men come back from long service. Sometimes they get attached to situations because they need something to protect. It can cloud judgment. The words were arranged to sound compassionate. That made them uglier. Mason's thumb moved once across the chipped edge of the orange screwdriver in his thigh pocket. "Explain that to Brooke." Curtis studied him. "You think experience makes you good at reading people?" "No." The answer seemed to surprise him. Mason continued, "It makes me careful about believing I can. A county vehicle entered the lot 10 minutes later, followed by a sheriff's cruiser. Brooke stepped out wearing her forest green parka and burnt orange knit cap. Her dented metal clipboard was tucked beneath one arm. The deputy with her was a quiet man in his 30s who remained near the cruiser and let Brooke take the lead. She did not approach Ember directly. She angled her body, stopped well outside the dog's reach, and looked first at Mason. Everyone keeping their hands to themselves? So far. Let's preserve the miracle. Curtis produced the documents with renewed confidence. Brooke read them standing beside the truck. She checked the kennel identification number through her tablet, called the veterinary office listed on the transfer certificate, and asked Curtis 3 questions in different ways. His answers changed slightly each time. The facility license had expired 7 months earlier. The physical address on the ownership certificate belonged to an empty commercial lot outside Boise. The veterinarian whose signature appeared on the health release had lost his license the previous year. Most importantly, the chip number on Curtis's document differed from Ember's scanned number by 2 digits. Curtis claimed it was a clerical error. Brooke clipped the pages to her board. Maybe. Bring the originals to my office tomorrow, along with the complete transfer history and proof of legal ownership. We can take the dogs now and settle the records there. No. Curtis's face hardened. Brooke did not raise her voice. The animals remain under county authority. Mr. Redfern is their temporary foster custodian. You do not remove them, approach his property, or contact him directly until verification is complete. Leon looked toward the deputy. The calculation in his posture changed. Not surrender. Delay. Curtis accepted a copy of Brooke's written notice. He folded it once, too sharply, and put it inside his jacket. As he turned toward a silver SUV parked farther down the lot, he looked back at Mason. You don't know what you're holding for someone else. Mason glanced down at Ember. She was no longer pressed flat against the snow, but she had not relaxed. I know she has a name. Curtis gave him a long look. Then he and Leon left. That evening, the lake beyond Mason's house reflected a deep blue sky. The air had grown colder, and frost was forming around the lower corners of the workshop windows. Mason was updating Brooke's contact log when Ember rose from the rug. Her head turned toward the road. A dark SUV had stopped beyond the pines, several hundred yards from the house. Its lights were off. The engine remained running, exhaust drifting above the roof in a pale cloud. Mason stepped onto the porch. The vehicle began moving almost immediately. He could have reached his truck before it disappeared around the bend. He could have followed far enough to read the plate. Every old instinct told him that uncertainty was a problem solved by movement. Instead, he stayed beneath the porch light. He memorized the direction, the shape of the rear lamps, and the first visible characters of the plate. Then he sent the information to Brooke. When he came back inside, Ember stood near the stove, rigid from shoulder to tail. Mason sat on the floor beside the open doorway. He did not call her. He did not tell her everything was safe, because he did not yet know that. Finch appeared from behind the workbench, carrying one of Mason's black mechanic gloves. The glove covered most of the puppy's face, causing him to walk sideways into a chair leg. He recovered, crossed the room with great determination, and dropped it between Mason and Ember. Then he sat down, a diplomat presenting the only treaty he understood. Mason looked at the glove. Strong terms. Finch placed one paw on it. Ember approached and nudged the puppy backward. She took the glove gently in her mouth, but before turning away, she stopped beside Mason. Her shoulder remained several inches from his hand, close enough for warmth to exist between them. Not close enough to be claimed. Mason left his palm resting on his own knee. After a few seconds, Ember walked back toward the stove, with Finch following her. She had noticed what Mason had not done. He had not chased the SUV. He had not used her fear to justify becoming dangerous. And for one quiet moment beside the open door, restraint had become the first promise between them that required no words. 2 days after the men in the parking lot produced false papers and called Ember by a number, Graham Tolland telephoned Mason Redfern. Mason was at his workbench when the call came, replacing a corroded connector inside a county emergency radio. The casing lay open beneath the hanging lamp. A line of small screws rested beside his chipped orange-handled screwdriver, arranged in the order he had removed them. Ember lay near the stove, with Finch tucked against her side. The puppy had found an old roll of electrical tape and was attempting to peel it apart with the concentration of a surgeon and the technique of a raccoon. Mason did not recognize the number. He recognized the voice before the man finished saying his name. Mason. Low, measured, never hurried. Even through a phone speaker, Graham Tolland's voice seemed capable of making a room straighten its furniture. Mason's hand stopped above the radio. Commander. The title left him before he decided to use it. There was a pause on the other end. Not long enough to seem deliberate, but long enough for Mason to notice that Tolland had heard it. I haven't been anyone's commander in a long time, Tolland said. Old habits. Some are worth keeping. Mason looked across the room at Ember. Her head had lifted. She was watching his face, not the phone. Tolland said he had been informed that Mason had found a German shepherd, formerly connected to Valor Ridge Canine Recovery. He apologized for the behavior of Curtis Hale and Leon Pike, describing their visit as an unauthorized attempt to correct a contractor's mistake. Unauthorized, Mason repeated. They should have gone through the county. I made that clear. After they came to me? Yes. Tolland did not sound defensive. He sounded disappointed in a situation that had failed to meet his standards. According to him, Ember had once served in a behavioral support program at Valor Ridge. She had worked with veterans who struggled in crowded spaces, helping them regulate panic before it became a crisis. When her own responses grew unreliable, she had been transferred to a long-term care partner. The transfer was handled by an outside contractor, Tolland said. I'm reviewing what happened. Where was she transferred? I'll bring the records. What about the puppy? Another pause. I didn't know there was one. Mason's gaze moved to Finch, who had succeeded in sticking part of the tape to his own paw and now appeared offended by the consequences of progress. Tolland continued. I'd like to attend the verification meeting myself. No pressure, no private arrangements. We do it through the county. It was exactly what an innocent man should have offered. That did not make Mason feel better. 17 years earlier, in a country Mason rarely named aloud, Graham Tolland had been the officer responsible for his task unit. The operation had gone wrong in less than 12 minutes. A damaged vehicle blocked the planned extraction route. Mason and 2 others became separated from the main element inside a cluster of half-collapsed industrial buildings. Communications failed. The higher command ordered the remaining team to withdraw before the situation trapped everyone. Tolland refused to accept that 3 men had become an acceptable subtraction. He coordinated a second route, redirected the rescue element, and remained on the radio while Mason's group moved through smoke, concrete dust, and failing light. The decision brought all 3 men home. It also nearly ended Tolland's career. During the internal review, he did not blame intelligence failures, weather, communication equipment, or the men who had become trapped. He said the decision had been his, and that he would make it again. Mason had never forgotten that. A man's philosophy could be written in speeches. His character was usually written in what he was willing to risk when there was no audience. For years, Tolland had been Mason's clearest proof that loyalty could be stronger than procedure. "I'll see you at Brooks' office," Mason said. After the call ended, he remained seated at the workbench. Finch finally shook the tape free and sent it beneath a cabinet. Ember rose, crossed halfway toward Mason, then stopped. He reached for the screwdriver. His thumb rubbed once over the chipped orange handle. The radio in front of him was still open. The damaged connection remained exactly where it had been before the call. But the problem no longer looked simple. Brooke Sutter's office occupied the rear half of the County Animal Services building, between a storage room and a narrow examination bay that smelled faintly of disinfectant, dog hair, and wet winter coats. She had moved the meeting there because Ember was already familiar with the building. The room had 2 doors, no metal examination table, and enough open space for the dog to choose where she stood. Mason arrived with Ember in her moss-green harness, and Finch wearing the mustard-colored one he had nearly outgrown. Graham Tolland was already waiting. At 62, he remained tall and carefully composed. His silver-white hair was combed back from a high forehead, and a short, precisely trimmed beard followed the line of his jaw. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a navy quarter-zip sweater, gray trousers, and dark leather gloves. Nothing about him asked for attention. Rooms gave it anyway. The woman beside him rose when Mason entered. Dana Mercer was 52, with a full, steady build and reddish-brown hair cut to her chin. One pale streak crossed the front near her left temple. She wore a cream sweater beneath a wine-colored quilted vest and held a ring of labeled keys in one hand. Her expression was warm, but not careless. "Dana runs our residential program," Tolland said. "She knows the people affected by anything involving Valor Ridge." Dana offered Mason her hand, then noticed Ember watching the movement and lowered it without embarrassment. "I've heard you've been taking good care of them." "I've been following the instructions." "That may be the rarest form of good care." Brooke sat behind her dented clipboard at the end of the table. "Let's discuss dogs before everyone becomes philosophical." Tolland placed a slim file in front of her. The records confirmed that Ember had once belonged to Valor Ridge. They included vaccination history, behavioral assessments, and notes from her work with several adult veterans. The earlier entries described a calm, highly responsive dog who could recognize escalating anxiety and place herself beside the distressed person without being commanded. Then the records changed. The later notes became shorter. Reduced reliability. Protective displacement. Unsuitable for continued placement. Finally, there was a transfer authorization to a facility called Northern Companion Holdings. Brooke turned several pages. "There are 10 months missing." Tolland folded his gloves on the table, one over the other. "The receiving facility was responsible for updates after transfer. The facility Curtis named was Granite Peak Sporting Dogs. I don't know that organization. The health certificate he carried listed a different chip number. Which is why I said his approach was unauthorized." Brooke looked at Dana. "Did your residential program track Ember after transfer?" Dana removed her round glasses and held them between both hands. "No. We were told she had gone to a long-term behavioral placement. I handled housing, staffing, and veteran services. Animal transfers were managed separately." The answer sounded honest. It also revealed how easily responsibility could disappear between departments. Brooke asked about Finch. Tolland looked down at the puppy, who was trying to place both front paws on Mason's boot without falling over. "I had no knowledge Ember was pregnant," he said. "Could she have been used in a breeding program? Not through Valor Ridge?" The wording was precise. Mason noticed Brooke heard it too. Not she was never bred. Not that would have been impossible. Only not through Valor Ridge. Ember had remained near the far wall throughout the meeting. She watched Tolland without approaching. Her body was not rigid, but her attention never left his hands. Tolland stood when Brooke said the county would extend Mason's temporary custody while the missing history was verified. He rose slowly, gathering his gloves and closing the file. Then his right hand turned downward. 2 fingers drew together. It was barely a gesture at all. Ember recoiled. Her hindquarters struck the wall. She lowered her body, swept Finch beneath her chest, and fixed her eyes on Tolland's hand. Finch stopped moving. The room changed. Dana looked from Ember to Tolland. Brooke's pen became still. Mason felt a pulse of cold move beneath his skin. Not because Ember had proven anything. A frightened animal could connect one gesture to many people. Memory did not testify under oath. But Tolland's reaction was wrong. His face did not show surprise. For a fraction of a second, irritation tightened the corner of his mouth, as though a familiar response had appeared in front of the wrong witnesses. Then the expression vanished. He lowered his hand. "Old conditioning," he said. Mason looked at him. "You recognize it." "I recognize fear." "That isn't what I asked." Tolland met Mason's gaze. The silence between them contained 17 years, 1 failed operation, and 3 men brought home alive. Brooke closed the folder. "Ember and Finch remain with Mason. No one from Valor Ridge or any contractor contacts him directly. Future communication comes through this office." Tolland inclined his head. "Understood." He did not argue. That restraint unsettled Mason more than anger would have. At the door, Tolland stopped. "Come see Valor Ridge," he said, "before you decide what one reaction means." Mason looked toward Ember. She had not moved from the wall. "I haven't decided anything." "Good." Tolland's voice softened. "Then come look at the whole thing." Valor Ridge stood on a sunlit slope south of the valley, where open fields met a line of dark fir trees. The main buildings were not luxurious. They were clean, practical, and well-maintained. 2 long residential lodges, a workshop, a training field, and a low veterinary annex. Paths had been shoveled wide enough for wheelchairs. Handrails ran beside the steeper steps. Smoke rose from several chimneys into the clear afternoon. Mason went alone the following day. Ember and Finch remained with Elise. Dana met him near the administrative building and led him through the property. Inside one lodge, a former Army mechanic named Paul showed Mason the small room he had received after spending nearly a year living in his truck. In the workshop, another veteran repaired snowmobile engines beside a black Labrador who slept beneath the bench. No one appeared staged for Mason's benefit. The gratitude was real. So was the work. Dana knew every resident's schedule, which apartment heater needed replacement, and which man had started attending group meals after 6 months of eating alone. "What happens if funding disappears?" Mason asked. Her expression tightened. "People don't just lose a program. Some lose the first place they've slept without keeping a chair against the door." They crossed toward the canine buildings. Most of the runs were open and clean. Dogs moved through training yards with handlers who used food, toys, and patient repetition. At the far end, however, one older kennel block remained closed. Frost clouded the narrow windows. A printed sign read, "Maintenance, no entry." Mason noticed name boards stacked beside the door. Some had dates. Others carried only the phrase "transferred to specialized care." No destination was written beneath them. Dana saw him looking. "That building hasn't been used since before I took over residential operations." "Who controlled it?" "Canine administration." "Tolland?" She hesitated. "Ultimately, Graham controls everything here." Not proudly, not accusingly, simply as a fact no one had questioned until now. In the administration hall, a public donor board displayed years of uneven funding. 2 winters earlier, Valor Ridge had been close to collapse. Then private contributions had risen sharply. Large donations. Repeated amounts. No individual names, only a category marked Closed Sponsor Events. Mason stood before the board longer than necessary. A good place did not become false because something inside it was wrong. That was the problem. It would have been easier if Valor Ridge had been cruel in every room. Instead, men had homes here. Dogs rested beside them. Dana carried keys to apartments that might otherwise have been empty because their occupants were dead or sleeping in vehicles. Truth had become inconveniently crowded. Tolland found Mason near the upper field. He led him along a short path to a stone memorial overlooking the valley. Names from their former unit were engraved into dark granite. Snow rested in the carved letters. Mason recognized everyone. Tolland stood beside him, gloved hands clasped behind his back. "You think I don't understand why you're cautious?" "I haven't said what I think." "You rarely had to." Mason looked at the names. Tolland continued. "Valor Ridge has helped hundreds of people. Ember's condition is unacceptable. The contractor's paperwork is unacceptable. I will find out who failed." "You keep calling it failure." "What would you call it?" "I don't know yet." Tolland turned toward him. "That uncertainty can become vanity, Mason. A man starts believing his suspicion is more honest than everyone else's work." Mason said nothing. Below them, the training field was bright with snow. A veteran walked slowly beside a shepherd using 2 hiking poles. The dog adjusted its pace every time the man faltered. Tolland watched them too. "Do not let one damaged animal erase everything you saw today. She isn't an argument." "No, she's a dog." The sentence was calm. It still sounded like a reduction. Tolland faced the memorial again. "Loyalty only means something when it survives inconvenience." Mason had heard him say those words years ago, before a mission, when fear was thick enough to taste, and every man needed to believe the person beside him would remain there. Back then, the sentence had felt like a light. On the drive home, the sun lowered behind the mountains and turned the snowfields amber. Mason kept both hands on the steering wheel. He thought of the men living at Valor Ridge, of Ember against the wall, of Dana's keys, of Tolland's hand turning downward. For the first time, Mason wondered whether a guiding light could become dangerous without changing its brightness. Perhaps the danger began when a man trusted the light so completely that he stopped looking at the hand carrying it. The investigation did not move like a hunt. There was no single track through the snow, no broken branch pointing toward the truth, no witness waiting in a dark room with every answer prepared. It moved the way winter roads were cleared in the mountains. Slowly, one narrow strip at a time, with long stretches where the work seemed to reveal nothing except more white ahead. For 3 weeks, Mason learned to live with that pace. Each morning he checked Ember's food, Finch's weight, the county contact log, and whatever message Brooke Sutter had left overnight. Then he returned to his repair work, replacing corroded radio parts and testing emergency beacons, while a criminal investigation grew in pieces beyond his control. That last part remained difficult. Mason had spent most of his adult life in environments where uncertainty demanded action. Now the people handling the case repeatedly asked him to wait. Waiting felt dangerously similar to doing nothing. Elise Navarro was the first to find something solid. She called Mason to the clinic on a gray Tuesday morning. Snow had begun melting along the edges of the town roads, turning the clean white into ridges of wet salt and gravel. Ember remained in the examination room without trying to retreat behind Mason. That was new. She stood beside him, her moss-colored harness loose against her chest, while Finch attempted to remove a paper label from a cabinet drawer. Elise sat before her computer, dark hair tied low, the silver streak at her temple bright beneath the overhead light. "I had the chip history reviewed by the manufacturer," she said. Mason looked at the screen. The record showed several dates, each attached to a registration change. Valor Ridge had originally registered Ember under its own name. 14 months earlier, ownership had supposedly transferred to a long-term behavioral facility in Nevada. Except the receiving facility had never accepted her. "They checked the intake logs?" Mason asked. "Every dog for the last 5 years." Elise opened a second file. Someone had altered Ember's digital registration twice after the false transfer. A breeding status field had also been removed. The system still carried a faint record of the change, like writing erased hard enough to tear the paper beneath it. "What does that prove?" Mason asked. "By itself? That someone manipulated a database." "Not who?" "No." Elise turned from the screen and looked at Ember. The dog's black mantle had begun to regain its shine. The hollows near her hips were less severe, but she still watched every door. "It proves her history didn't disappear naturally," Elise said. "Someone wanted the next person looking at the file to stop asking questions." Brooks' findings arrived 2 days later. The company listed on Curtis Hale's ownership certificate had been dissolved nearly a year earlier. Granite Peak Sporting Dogs had no active license, no physical kennel, and no tax record indicating it had ever employed Curtis or Leon. Both men, however, received payments from another company, Granite Passage Events. The name sounded respectable enough to host corporate retreats, outdoor conferences, or expensive weddings where everyone wore boots they had never dirtied. Its filings described private sporting exhibitions and sponsor experiences. The transactions linked to it crossed 3 counties. That was when Brooke brought in Kendra Weller. Kendra arrived at Mason's house with no dramatic announcement and no interest in being impressed by him. She was 46, tall and composed, with short natural curls and silver-framed glasses she wore only when reading. Her quilted graphite coat looked too clean for Mason's workshop, but she stepped around the scattered radio casings without complaint. She placed a slim folder on his table and sat across from him. Ember remained near the stove. Finch immediately inspected Kendra's boots. Kendra looked down. "Does he always conduct interviews this way?" "He believes footwear contains state secrets." Finch pushed his nose beneath one lace. Kendra moved her foot without touching him. "Persistent." "Unqualified." She opened the folder. Kendra worked for the state's Financial Crimes Unit. Brooke had contacted her because Granite Passage's payments crossed county lines and appeared connected to a non-profit organization receiving public support. Mason explained the parking lot, Leon's signal, Ember's reaction, and the inconsistencies at Valor Ridge. Kendra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she removed her glasses and folded them. "A frightened dog is not a search warrant." "I know." "A suspicious gesture is not a financial record." "I know that too." "And your history with Graham Tolland makes you both useful and unreliable." Mason leaned back slightly. "Unreliable." "Emotionally involved." Kendra met his eyes. "That does not mean dishonest. It means you may notice what others miss and assign meaning where there is none. Both can be true." The words irritated him because they were reasonable. Kendra opened the folder again. "I need money, records, and people willing to sign their names beneath what they claim." Mason glanced toward Ember. Kendra followed his gaze. "She may be the reason you care," she said, "but she cannot carry the case for you." That afternoon, Mason understood the investigation had crossed a boundary. It no longer belonged to his suspicion. He was not sure whether that felt like relief or loss. Raymond Vick contacted him the following week. The message contained only a name, a phone number, and a request to meet somewhere public. Mason forwarded it to Brooke before answering. Kendra approved the meeting but instructed him not to promise protection, immunity, or any outcome he had no authority to offer. They met at a crowded restaurant near the ski lifts, where wet gloves hung over chair backs and the windows fogged from too many people escaping the cold. Raymond sat in a booth facing the entrance. He was 57, heavy through the shoulders, with thinning brown-gray hair and a poorly trimmed beard. A faded navy trucker cap rested beside his tee. His fingers kept turning something attached to his key ring beneath the table. Mason later realized it was an 8-year sobriety coin. Raymond looked at him once, then toward the room. "You bring anyone?" "Not inside." Raymond nodded as though he had expected that answer and feared it anyway. He slid a folded stack of photocopies across the table. Transport calendars, dates, vehicle numbers, dog identification codes, and destination initials. Some entries were marked specialized placement, others carried the letters SP-EVAL beside weekend dates. "What does that mean?" Mason asked. "Sponsor evaluation." Raymond's voice was low and rough. "That's what they called it." He had managed the canine housing area at Valor Ridge for nearly 6 years. At first, the transfers had seemed legitimate. Some dogs truly needed different environments. Others could not safely continue support work. But then the departures began happening late on Fridays, after most veterinary staff had gone home. The same vehicles arrived. The same men signed the papers. Curtis Hale was one of them. "Leon?" Mason asked. "Security. He never called it that, but that's what he was." Raymond stared at his untouched tea. Employees were told that wealthy sponsors wanted private demonstrations of working dog ability. The money supported housing and treatment programs for veterans. Staff were discouraged from asking questions because donor privacy had to be protected. Raymond had seen Ember loaded into one of the vehicles. She had been wearing a broad control harness and refusing to move forward. "What happened before that?" Mason asked. Raymond rubbed one thumb over the sobriety coin. "They tried to get her to react to another dog." Mason's jaw tightened. Raymond raised his eyes quickly. "I didn't see them hurt her." The words came too fast. Not a lie, a defense. "She wouldn't engage," Raymond continued. "She kept stepping between the other dog and the handler, like she was trying to break up the exercise." That matched everything Mason had seen in her. Ember had not failed because she lacked protective instinct. She had failed because she protected the wrong participant. "You reported it?" Mason asked. Raymond's eyes dropped. "No." The restaurant filled the silence around them. Plates touched tables. Someone laughed near the counter. A coffee grinder screamed briefly and stopped. "Tolland paid for my treatment," Raymond said. 8 years ago, I was sleeping in the back of a feed store and telling everyone I could quit drinking whenever I wanted. He found the program, paid what insurance wouldn't, gave me work afterward." Mason said nothing. "I had rent," Raymond continued. "No savings. They reminded us we'd signed confidentiality agreements, said false accusations could destroy housing for veterans who had nowhere else to go. You thought the transfers were wrong. I thought they might be wrong. That was enough to ask." Raymond's face tightened, but he did not look away. "Yes." The answer was quieter than an apology. He pushed the calendars closer to Mason. "I kept copies because I wanted proof before I spoke." "You had them for how long?" 11 months. Mason felt anger rise, but it had nowhere clean to go. Raymond had failed Ember. He was also sitting here now, frightened and ashamed, offering the first records that could be tested. "I kept telling myself I hadn't seen enough," Raymond said. "That's how a man turns cowardice into caution." The sentence struck Mason harder than he expected. For days, Mason had told himself he was being careful because Tolland once saved his life, because Valor Ridge housed people, because one damaged record did not erase 1,000 good acts. Perhaps caution and cowardice did not always wear different coats. Sometimes the difference appeared only after someone else paid the price. Mason did not forgive Raymond. He also did not punish him with words. "Will you sign a statement?" Raymond's hand closed around the keyring. Fear moved visibly through him. Then he nodded once. "If it goes through the state investigator." "It will. Not the press." "No promises beyond the process." Raymond almost smiled. "You're bad at making this sound safe." "It isn't safe." Raymond looked down at the calendars. "Good," he said. "I'm tired of men making dangerous things sound reasonable." The transport records gave Kendra a structure. Granite Passage Events had rented an old ice arena in another county on 7 weekends, listed in Raymond's calendars. Each rental was described as a private canine performance seminar. On the following Mondays, Valor Ridge received unusually large cash donations through a sponsor fund. The amounts varied, but the pattern did not. A cooperating witness filled in the rest. Derek Sloan was a 53-year-old regional construction owner who had attended 2 events. His attorney contacted Kendra after learning Granite Passage was under review. Sloan did not present himself as brave. He wanted reduced legal exposure. He provided invitation cards, payment codes, and a printed list of wagering rules disguised as sponsor rankings. The documents never openly described animal fighting, but they referred to paired performance rounds, odds, and cash settlement procedures. There were no violent recordings. Kendra did not need them. The financial pattern, event rules, transport records, and false ownership documents created something more useful than outrage. They created a case. Dana Mercer resisted when Kendra first contacted her. She agreed to meet in her office at Valor Ridge, but refused to release residential files unrelated to the investigation. Outside her window, snow covered the roofs of the housing lodges she had helped build. 23 people live here, Dana said. Some have nowhere to return to. Kendra placed a ledger copy on the desk. I'm not asking you to abandon them. You investigate the funding and the organization may collapse. It may. Dana's face hardened. Kendra did not soften the truth. Then she showed her the sponsor deposits, the missing money, and the final authorization attached to several internal transfers. Graham Tolland's signature appeared at the bottom. Dana removed her glasses. She held them with both hands and stared through the window. He saved people here, she said. Kendra closed the file. That can remain true. Dana looked at her. And the rest? The rest can be true too. No revelation transformed Dana in that moment. She did not condemn Tolland or pledge loyalty to the investigation. She asked for copies. Then she began listing the names of housing partners who might take residence if Valor Ridge lost funding. Her first response to betrayal was not anger. It was making sure innocent people would still have beds. While the adults built their case from paper, Ember changed in measurements too small for any official report. She ate while Mason remained in the kitchen. She allowed him to clip the lead to her green harness without backing away. She began sleeping several feet from the door instead of directly in front of it. One morning, Mason sat on the floor checking a damaged beacon. Ember approached without being called. She touched her nose to his wrist. Then she lowered her head onto his knee. The wait lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Mason did not move. Finch appeared from beneath the table carrying a dish towel and ruined the silence by backing into a chair. Ember lifted her head and went to rescue the towel from him. The moment ended without ceremony, but Mason remained still long afterward. The investigation now contained shell companies, falsified records, anonymous donations, and people calculating how much truth they could afford. Ember understood none of that. What she understood was whether a hand reached too quickly, whether a door remained open, whether the person beside her treated trust as a gift or a possession. Mason looked at the county custody papers on the table. He had begun this believing his task was to find out who had harmed her. Now he understood that was only part of it. He also had to prove, through patience, restraint, and every ordinary day afterward, that protection did not have to become another form of ownership. Graham Tolland chose the overlook above Redfish Lake because it was the kind of place where difficult things could be made to seem clean. The morning was bright enough to erase shadows. Below the ridge, the frozen lake stretched between the pines like a sheet of white steel. The sawtooth peaks stood beyond it under a hard blue sky, ancient and indifferent, as though they had listened to every excuse men had ever offered and found none worth answering. Mason arrived first. He wore his dark green parka over the olive-drab combat shirt, his hands bare despite the cold. The chipped orange handle of his screwdriver rested in the thigh pocket of his coyote brown pants. He had brought no recorder, no weapon beyond what the law already allowed him to carry, and no belief that the conversation would remain simple. Kendra knew about the meeting. She had not forbidden it because the investigation had not yet produced enough evidence for a warrant, and Tolland had requested the conversation before Mason became a formal cooperating witness. Her instructions had been brief. Do not accuse him. Do not promise anything. Do not tell him what we know. Most of all, do not mistake a confession of philosophy for a confession of crime. Mason heard a vehicle on the road behind him. Tolland stepped from a black SUV, wearing a navy field coat over a gray turtleneck, dark trousers and polished winter boots. His white hair was combed back neatly. Black leather gloves covered the hand whose smallest movement had once driven Ember against a wall. He walked to the railing and stood beside Mason, leaving several feet between them. For a while, neither man spoke. Below, wind moved loose snow across the lake in pale ribbons. You always did prefer high ground, Mason said. Tolland looked toward the mountains. It makes people speak more carefully, or feel smaller. Sometimes that helps. The answer carried the old rhythm Mason remembered, measured, dry, confident enough to sound like wisdom before anyone had time to test it. Tolland removed his gloves one finger at a time and folded them over the railing. I know Kendra Weller is involved. Mason did not react. Tolland glanced at him. You were never good at pretending not to know something. I learned from men who were worse at pretending not to control everything. A faint smile touched Tolland's face. It was almost affection. That made the moment harder. I did not ask you here to threaten you, Tolland said. Good. I asked because the people investigating this see transactions, contractors, and incomplete files. You have seen Valor Ridge. I have. You met the residents. Yes. You know what happens if the organization collapses. Mason looked across the lake. 23 adults lived in the residential buildings. Some had jobs through the workshops. Others depended on the treatment network Dana managed. They were not responsible for Granite Passage. Most probably did not know the company existed. Tolland continued. 2 winters ago, our largest federal grant ended. 3 private foundations changed priorities. Donations fell by nearly half. We had payroll, heating costs, clinical contracts, and men who had nowhere else to go. You could have closed admissions and put more people back on the road. You could have told the board. The board would have closed 2 lodges. Then you should have let them make that decision. Tolland turned to him. That is the luxury of people who do not have to look someone in the face and say there is no bed. Mason felt the first pull of anger, but beneath it was recognition. Tolland had always known where responsibility hurt most. He understood that leadership rarely failed because choices were easy. It failed because the wrong choice often arrived carrying the suffering the right choice would cause. "What did Granite Passage offer?" Mason asked. Tolland did not deny the name. That absence of denial settled between them. "Private sponsors wanted performance evaluations," he said. "Working dogs that had been removed from placement, animals already judged unsuitable for service." "Unsuitable does not mean disposable." "No." "Then what does it mean?" Tolland's jaw tightened slightly. At first, controlled assessments, temperament, endurance, response under pressure, nothing outside what some training facilities already conduct. At first. Tolland looked back toward the lake. Then the sponsors began wagering among themselves. The words were quiet. The mountains did not move. "You knew," Mason said. "I knew it was happening." And continued. "I knew the money kept the lodges open." Tolland's voice remained calm, but the calm no longer felt effortless. It felt constructed, each word placed carefully over something unstable. "We paid overdue medical contracts. We expanded winter housing. We kept 11 people from being discharged into temporary motels. When I tried to end the sponsor events, another funding gap appeared. Then another." "So you made the next exception?" "I made the decision in front of me." "And the one after that?" "Yes." The honesty did not absolve him. It made him more difficult to hate. Tolland picked up one glove, then set it down again. "Every command decision has a cost. You know that." "This wasn't a command." "No? You think organizations survive without triage? Without choosing what can be preserved?" Mason studied the man who had once refused to accept him as a reasonable loss. Tolland had not abandoned his old language. He had widened it until almost anything could fit inside. "Mission," Mason said. "Acceptable loss. Protect the majority." Tolland looked at him sharply. "You say that as though the ideas became false because you dislike where they led." "They became convenient. Convenience would have been shutting the doors." "No." Mason's voice lowered. "Convenience was choosing victims who couldn't object at a board meeting." For the first time, something harder appeared in Tolland's face. Not guilt, injury, as though Mason had violated a private rule by speaking to him without gratitude. "Be careful," Tolland said. The old warning lived inside the words. Mason's body remembered it before his mind did. His spine straightened. His breathing slowed. Some part of him still expected the next sentence to contain the correct direction, the safe route, the order that would bring everyone home. Tolland saw the response. That was when Mason understood the second truth beneath the first. Valor Ridge mattered to Tolland. The people living there mattered. But so did being the man who had saved them. The organization was not only his work, it was the final proof of the identity he had spent a lifetime building. The commander who always found a way, the leader who never admitted a mission could exceed him. If Valor Ridge failed honestly, Tolland would have been forced to accept a limit. Instead, he had chosen secrecy, not only to preserve the lodges, to preserve the man in the center of them. Tolland reached into his coat and removed a thin envelope. He did not offer it immediately. "Ember and the puppy can remain with you permanently," he said. "Valor Ridge will release any claim. I will also arrange a legitimate grant through an independent foundation, enough for you to build a regional support program of your own." Mason looked at the envelope. "How much?" "Enough to matter." "And what do I say?" "That Curtis Hale and Leon Pike acted beyond their authority, that the irregularities came from outside contractors, You stop pressing speculation about the rest. You want me to lie. I want you to prevent a collapse that will harm people who had nothing to do with this. It was not an empty offer. Mason could see the shape of what it might purchase. A workshop expanded into a training space, paid staff, rooms for veterans who hated crowded clinics, medical care for Ember and Finch, a program built without begging donors every winter. He could keep the dogs safe. He could keep Valor Ridge open. He could tell himself he had chosen the living over the principle. That was what made the offer dangerous. It did not ask him to become greedy. It asked him to become practical. Tolland held the envelope by one corner. You know there are times when something must be sacrificed to save what remains. Mason looked at the black glove folded on the railing. 17 years earlier, men above Tolland had used nearly the same reasoning. The extraction window was closing. 3 operators were cut off. The remaining team had to be preserved. Tolland had refused. Mason turned toward him. You taught me to go back. That was a different situation. You taught me the person left behind was still part of the people worth saving. Tolland's eyes narrowed. A dog is not one of our men. No. Mason thought of Ember placing her body across Finch in the snow. That should have made it easier to protect her, not easier to spend her. Tolland lowered the envelope. For a moment, neither man resembled the roles they had once held. There was no commander and no operator. Only 2 aging men standing above a frozen lake, measuring the distance between what they had believed and what they had become. Mason did not take the envelope. He did not threaten to expose Tolland. He did not tell him what Raymond had provided or what Kendra had traced. I need to go, Mason said. Tolland's expression hardened. If Valor Ridge falls, you will not get to pretend the consequences belong only to me. I know. Do you? Yes. Mason put on his gloves. That's why Dana is working on housing transfers. The smallest crack appeared in Tolland's composure. Mason saw it and regretted revealing even that much. But the damage was done. Tolland's gaze shifted toward the road, already calculating. Mason walked away before the conversation could become something either of them would later call necessary. Kendra received him in a conference room at the county building. Brooke sat beside her with a legal pad. Dana joined by secure video from a partner organization in Boise. Mason repeated the conversation exactly, including the offer, the references to sponsor events, and his mistake in mentioning the housing plan. Kendra did not praise his restraint. She did not criticize the mistake immediately either. You gave him reason to believe the investigation has reached inside Valor Ridge, she said. I know. He may alter records. Then I made it worse. You made one part harder. Kendra adjusted her silver-framed glasses. That is not the same as ruining the case. Dana spoke from the screen. I have commitments for 14 residents. Temporary placements for 6 more. 3 are refusing to leave. Why? Mason asked. They think accepting relocation means betraying Graham. The sentence landed heavily. Loyalty had spread through Valor Ridge like wiring behind a wall, useful, invisible, and dangerous when no one checked what it was connected to. Dana continued. I'm not telling them the investigation details. I'm giving them options. They need to choose. Mason thought of Ember waiting beside the open transport crate. Choice again. Not rescue imposed from above. A door left open long enough for someone frightened to decide. That evening, Mason sat near the wood stove with an untouched bowl of soup cooling on the table. He had expected refusing Tolland to feel clean. It did not. Valor Ridge might still close. People might lose routines, counselors, rooms, and the first stable community they had trusted in years. Tolland had created that good before corrupting the means used to preserve it. Mason could not divide the man into two convenient halves. Ember lay on the far side of the room. Finch slept between her front legs, his paws twitching against the rug. After a while, the puppy woke. He looked at Ember, then at Mason. Finch stood, stretched badly, stumbled over one of his own feet, and walked across the room. He climbed onto Mason's boot, turned twice, and lowered himself across the leather as though it were the bed he had intended to choose all along. Mason looked toward Ember. She remained where she was. Her eyes followed Finch, but she did not rise to retrieve him. She did not block the distance between them. Slowly, she lowered her head onto her paws and closed her eyes. Mason did not touch the puppy. He understood what had changed. Ember had not handed Finch over to him. She had allowed Finch's choice to stand. The trust in that moment contained no command, no debt, and no promise that could be collected later. Mason sat there until the soup went cold. In the morning, he called Kendra. "I'll make the recorded call." Kendra arranged everything through the state attorney assigned to the case. Mason sat in the same county conference room, a digital recorder on the table, and written instructions beside his hand. Brooke watched through the interior window. Kendra remained across from him, expression unreadable. "Do not lead him into language he would not naturally use," she said. "I understand." "Do not argue." "I understand." "And if he asks whether law enforcement is present?" "I don't lie." Kendra nodded once. Mason dialed. Tolland answered after 3 rings. "Mason." "I've been thinking about the offer." A pause. "I assumed you would." Mason kept his voice tired rather than accusatory. That required little acting. "What happens to Valor Ridge if the sponsor money stops?" "We lose 2 lodges within months, possibly the canine program." "And the private events?" Tolland exhaled slowly. "You know enough to understand why they existed. Not enough to understand how far they went." "Farther than I intended." It was not a confession to a specific act. Kendra wrote something on her pad. Mason continued. "Why Ember?" "She had been removed from placement." "That wasn't my question." Another silence. "She was no longer useful to the program." Mason's fingers tightened beneath the table. Kendra lifted one hand, reminding him not to react. Tolland said, "Do not turn one animal into a moral symbol because you need the world to be simple." What should she have been? A difficult decision. "And Finch?" "I did not know about the puppy." "But if you had?" Tolland's voice sharpened. "This is exactly the problem, Mason. You are willing to destroy housing for dozens of veterans because a few dogs became the focus of your conscience. A few. A few dogs cannot matter more than the people depending on that organization." There it was, not an admission of the entire scheme, something more revealing in another way. The moral architecture that had allowed it. Tolland continued, warning Mason that systems survived only because someone accepted costs others refused to see. He described Granite Passage as an outside sponsor network that had gone beyond its original purpose. He blamed Curtis and Leon for operational abuses, but admitted he had continued accepting the money after learning wagering existed. When the call ended, the room remained quiet. Kendra stopped the recorder. "Not enough by itself," she said. Mason looked at her. "But?" "Combined with Raymond's signed statement, Sloane's materials, the transfer calendars, the sponsor deposits, and the false records, it closes several gaps." She gathered the documents into a single file. "The next Granite Passage event is scheduled for the final Saturday of the Sawtooth Snow Festival." "How long until the warrant?" If the judge agrees with us, soon. Mason looked through the window at Brooke. What do you need from me? Kendra met his eyes. Your knowledge of the access roads. Nothing more unless requested. I know how Tolland thinks. That makes you useful. I can help plan the entry. No. The word was immediate. Mason stared at her. Kendra removed her glasses. From this point forward, you are not commanding this operation. The sentence should not have been difficult. Mason had followed orders for most of his adult life. Yet this was different. He knew the terrain. He knew Tolland. Ember was sleeping in his house because he had stopped beside the road. Every part of him wanted responsibility to mean control. Kendra waited. Mason looked down at his hands. Then he nodded. For the first time, he understood that stepping back was not the same as abandoning the mission. Sometimes responsibility meant trusting other people to carry what no one person had the right to own. By 6 p.m, the Sawtooth Snow Festival had turned the center of Ketchum into a small kingdom of light. Strings of amber bulbs crossed the streets between snow-covered roofs. Steam rose from paper cups of cider. A bluegrass band played beneath a temporary awning, while adults in bright winter coats gathered near carved ice animals, and laughing couples crossed the square with snow clinging to their boots. From the festival, no one could see the old arena 2 miles away. It stood beyond a row of warehouses at the edge of the industrial district, its faded metal roof buried beneath snow. The sign above the entrance had lost half its letters years earlier. A loading road curved behind the building toward a service gate hidden from the main street. Granite Passage had chosen the location carefully. The festival gave its guests a reason to be in town. The music covered the sound of arriving vehicles. The crowded roads made unfamiliar license plates invisible. Mason sat inside the state command van parked behind a closed equipment yard. A map of the district had been pinned to the wall. Colored marks showed the arena entrances, loading bays, and 2 narrow roads leading back toward the highway. Mason had helped Kendra identify which route could support a heavy transport vehicle in fresh snow, and which service lane ended at a drainage ditch hidden beneath the white. That was the limit of his assignment. He wore his olive-drab combat shirt beneath a forest green parka. His orange-handled screwdriver remained in the truck, deliberately left behind. There was nothing here for him to repair with his hands. Kendra stood beside the communications table in a graphite winter coat, listening to updates through one earpiece. Brooke sat near the rear doors with 2 animal control officers, reviewing transport assignments and temporary intake numbers. No one carried the excitement Mason had seen before military operations. This was not an assault. It was a legal intervention with veterinarians waiting 3 streets away, heated transport vans staged behind a warehouse, and paperwork prepared for every animal removed. The discipline was quieter than combat. In some ways, it required more patience. At Elise Navarro's clinic, Ember and Finch were nowhere near the arena. Mason had left them in the familiar recovery room with his wool blanket on the floor and Ember's moss-green harness hanging beside the open door. Finch had attempted to accompany him by climbing into his equipment bag, though only his head and one oversized front paw had fit. Elise had pulled him free and said, "Your operational readiness remains questionable." Finch had responded by stealing one of her disposable shoe covers. Ember had watched Mason leave without trying to follow. That had hurt more than he expected. It had also told him he had made the correct choice. He would not drag her back toward the people and sounds she feared simply because her presence might make him feel braver. Protection was not asking the wounded to prove what had happened to them. At 6:43, the first guest vehicle entered the arena's front lot. At 6:51, a second vehicle turned toward the service entrance. Updates arrived in fragments. Invitation verified. Cash transaction observed. Guest list photographed. Transport vehicle present. Mason listened without speaking. Across from him, Brooke tapped a blue pen against her clipboard once, then stopped herself. Kendra checked the time. The operation required evidence that the planned event had moved beyond private conversation, but they would intervene before any dogs were brought into the central arena. That line was narrow. Move too early, and the people responsible could claim the gathering was merely an exhibition. Move too late, and the investigation would protect its own success at the expense of the animals it was supposed to save. Mason understood why Kendra had kept him away from the decision. He would have acted the moment the first transport van arrived. That might have felt righteous. It might also have allowed the organizers to walk free and begin again somewhere else. A radio voice reported that financial officers had documented betting sheets, coded payments, and prepared cash envelopes inside an upstairs room. Another team confirmed that the central floor had been arranged for paired rounds. The dogs remained in closed transport compartments near the rear loading area. Kendra looked toward the state attorney seated at the communications desk. He gave one short nod. She lifted the radio. Execute. The word passed through the van without drama. Outside, engines started. Unmarked vehicles moved from both ends of the road. County deputies blocked the front exit while state officers entered through the public doors. Animal control vans advanced toward the service lane only after the arrest team secured the loading area. Mason stayed seated. Every instinct in him demanded movement. The map showed the rear gate. He knew the blind corner near the boiler annex. He knew Leon Pike would prefer the right side of an exit, and that Curtis Hale would look for a vehicle before he looked for cover. None of that made Mason the person who should go inside. He pressed both palms against his knees. The radio erupted with overlapping voices. Rear loading door opening, silver transport van moving, driver ignoring commands, service lane blocked. Then a pause. Mason could hear his own breathing. Vehicle stopped, a voice reported. 2 occupants detained, no injuries. Brooke exhaled. Curtis and Leon had attempted to move the transport van through the rear gate. They had made it less than 30 yards before officers blocked the lane with 2 county trucks. No shots had been fired. No one had been struck. The van remained upright, heated and closed until Elise's veterinary team arrived. Minutes later, another report came through. Animal secured in transport area, central floor unused. The words did not sound like triumph. They sounded better. They sounded like prevention. Mason lowered his head for a moment. All the documents, waiting, interviews, and uncomfortable restraint had led to something that would be difficult to show in a dramatic photograph. An empty arena floor. No wounded animals, no spectacle, nothing terrible for the public to witness afterward and call evidence. For the first time that night, Mason allowed himself to believe the operation might succeed without requiring suffering to justify it. Kendra touched his shoulder once. Stay here. He looked at her. I am staying. I know. I'm acknowledging the miracle. Under different circumstances, he might have smiled. They waited another 40 minutes before the building was declared secure. Guests had been separated for interviews. Cash, records, phones, and equipment were being documented. The veterinary teams had taken control of the transport area. Only then did Kendra permit Mason to enter. His role was narrow. Confirm several route markings Raymond Vick had described and identify whether a coded transfer board matched the copies Raymond had supplied. The old arena smelled of cold concrete, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of festival smoke drifting from town. Its public lobby had once sold tickets and hot chocolate. Now folding tables held evidence bags and numbered photographs. Officers moved without shouting. The silence felt deliberate, as if everyone understood that loud authority was unnecessary once the doors had been secured. Mason followed Kendra through a service corridor. Near the loading area, he saw the transport crates. The doors were still closed, but veterinary staff had lowered the lighting and covered portions of the compartments with blankets. No one dragged at the animals inside. Food and water had been placed near open access points. Each dog would be removed only when staff could do so safely. One crate door stood open. Nothing came out. A veterinary assistant sat several feet away on the floor, turned sideways, pretending to read a clipboard. Mason recognized the patience. It was the same distance Ember had once required from him beside a winter road. At the end of the corridor, 2 investigators stood with Graham Tolland. He was not handcuffed yet. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a navy sweater, his white hair still neat, though damp snow had darkened the shoulders. His posture remained straight. Only his face had changed. The confidence was still there, but it no longer filled the space around him. He looked older, not weak, merely unable to control what the room believed. Tolland saw Mason and dismissed the investigators with a glance as though they were junior officers awaiting permission. They did not move. "You betrayed me," he said. The words entered Mason's body like an old command. His shoulders tightened before he could stop them. The corridor disappeared for half a heartbeat, replaced by dust, broken radio traffic, and the younger version of himself, waiting for Tolland's voice to tell him where safety was. Then the arena returned. Cold lights, concrete walls, a transport area where no fight had begun. Mason let his hands remain open. "You saved my life," he said. "That will always be true." Something shifted in Tolland's eyes. For a moment he seemed to believe the sentence had restored the old order between them. Mason continued. "But one right thing in the past cannot protect every wrong thing that follows." Tolland's jaw hardened. "You think this is finished?" "No. Valor Ridge will lose funding. People will lose homes. Counselors will leave. Programs will close. When that happens, the officials standing around you will call it unfortunate and move on." Mason did not argue. Dana had found temporary placements. Kendra had followed the money. Brooke had protected the custody records. Elise had prepared the medical response. Raymond had signed his name beneath the truth he once feared. The operation did not belong to Mason, and neither would the consequences. That was what Tolland had never learned. Responsibility could be shared without being avoided. "I know people may suffer," Mason said. "Then stop this." "I can't." "You mean you won't?" Mason looked past him toward the covered transport compartments. "No. I mean it stopped being mine to control." Tolland stared at him. Perhaps that answer offended him more than accusation would have. For decades, Tolland had believed leadership meant standing where every decision passed through his hands. Even his corruption had grown from the certainty that only he could choose which losses were acceptable. An investigator stepped forward. Tolland placed his hands behind his back before being instructed. Even then, he turned compliance into something resembling command. As officers led him toward the lobby, he looked once over his shoulder. Mason did not follow. Curtis and Leon had already been taken out through the rear entrance. Other organizers remained in interview rooms. The evidence teams continued working. The dogs were moved last. Some stepped from their compartments after food was placed near the doors. Others remained inside until the building emptied and the noise decreased. One dog would not move at all. The staff left the crate door open, covered 3 sides, and waited beside it without reaching inside. Mason watched from a distance. There was no dramatic procession into freedom. Fear did not disappear because the correct people had arrived. Sometimes rescue was only a doorway left open long enough for terror to stop expecting punishment. Before dawn, The last transport van left for the temporary veterinary center. The arena floor remained empty. 2 days later, winter sunlight lay across the recovery center's outdoor yard. The confiscated dogs were housed inside separate, quiet areas, each with medical oversight and minimal handling. Elise brought Ember to the outer yard only after confirming there would be no direct contact. Finch stayed with Mason. The puppy had already turned the living room into a private republic governed by stolen socks and poor judgment. Mason decided the recovery center did not need his leadership. Ember wore her green harness, but no leash tension. She walked onto the snow, circled once, and lowered herself beside Elise. Through an open interior gate, several dogs could see the yard. Ember did not look for them. She did not perform. She simply lay beneath the clear sky, with her front paws crossed and her notched left ear tilted toward the building. Inside, one dog approached the open threshold. It stopped. A staff member seated nearby did not move. The dog looked toward Ember. After a long time, it placed one paw beyond the doorway. Then another. A second dog rose farther back in the room. Elise stood beside Mason near the fence. "She isn't leading them," she said. "I know. She isn't healing them. I know that too." Ember lowered her head into the sunlight. She was only showing them one possible outcome. A dog could step through an open door and find no hand waiting to force it farther. The newspapers called the operation the Granite Passage Raid. The name suggested speed, force, and conquest. Mason never used it. To him, it was the night the arena remained empty. The night preparation became evidence before cruelty became spectacle. The night no fight was permitted to begin. 8 months after the Granite Passage operation, the case had still not reached anything resembling a clean ending. Courtrooms rarely offered those. They offered schedules, revised charges, sealed agreements, continuances, and long afternoons beneath fluorescent lights while people tried to fit moral failure into language narrow enough for a statute. Graham Tolland entered guilty pleas to financial fraud, conspiracy connected to unlawful private events, and several violations involving the transfer and treatment of animals. Other charges remained under review as prosecutors examined the roles of donors, contractors, and people who had helped move money through Granite Passage. Curtis Hale and Leon Pike faced separate charges for falsified records, unlawful transport, and their direct involvement in organizing the events. Neither man had become suddenly remorseful. Curtis blamed instructions. Leon blamed the nature of the work. Both spoke as though responsibility were a package someone else had placed in their vehicle. Valor Ridge remained open. That outcome surprised people who believed justice had to look like a building with its doors chained shut. A temporary management board took control of the organization. Graham's authority was removed, accounts were frozen, and every canine transfer from the previous 4 years was reviewed. Dana Mercer worked with housing groups across Idaho to ensure the residents who had known nothing about Granite Passage did not lose their rooms, jobs, counselors, or medication. The process was imperfect. 3 residents refused to remain once the investigation became public. One accused Dana of helping destroy the only man who had ever believed in him. Another left without saying goodbye, and returned 2 weeks later after discovering that anger did not make motel rooms warmer. Dana welcomed him back without demanding an apology. She understood that people often defended the bridge that had once carried them, even after learning the wood beneath their feet was rotten. Raymond Vick testified at a public hearing held in a county courtroom, too small for the number of reporters outside. He wore a navy blazer over a pale gray shirt and kept his faded work boots beneath the table. His sobriety coin remained attached to his keyring. Every few minutes, his thumb found it through the fabric of his pocket, Raymond described the late transports, the coded schedules, the pressure placed on staff, and the day he watched Ember loaded into a vehicle after refusing to react against another dog. The opposing attorney asked why he had waited nearly a year to speak. Raymond did not hide behind the confidentiality agreement or the fear of losing his job. "I was grateful to the man in charge," he said, "and I let gratitude become an excuse for obedience." The room grew quiet. He swallowed and continued. "I kept telling myself I needed more proof. But the truth is, I wanted enough proof that speaking would cost me nothing. That amount of proof does not exist." No one applauded. Raymond did not deserve applause for finally doing what should have been done earlier. What he deserved was the chance to keep doing better after the room stopped watching. He returned to the temporary canine facility twice a week. He cleaned storage rooms, repaired fencing, and carried supplies without asking whether Ember would ever approach him. For months, she did not. Then one cold morning, while Raymond was setting down a box of food near Mason's porch, Ember crossed the yard and sniffed the cuff of his jacket. Raymond froze. She remained there for 2 seconds before walking away. He turned toward his truck and wiped at one eye, muttering something about the wind. Mason did not tell him the air was perfectly still. Mason testified 3 days after Raymond. He wore a simple navy blazer over a blue-gray shirt. No uniform. No medals. Nothing on his body asked the court to treat his past service as evidence that he was right. Graham Tolland sat across the room with his attorneys. He looked thinner. His white beard remained neatly trimmed, and the posture that had once filled command rooms had not disappeared. Even facing judgment, Graham carried himself like a man who believed the final report might still be rewritten in his favor. The prosecutor asked Mason about the mission 17 years earlier. Mason told the truth. He described how Graham had refused to withdraw, while Mason and 2 teammates remained cut off. He explained that Graham had coordinated the return effort, accepted professional consequences, and brought all 3 men home. The prosecutor paused. "Do you consider Graham Tolland responsible for saving your life?" "Yes." A murmur moved through the room. Graham lifted his eyes. Mason continued before the next question arrived. "That does not become untrue because of what he did later." The attorney representing Graham asked whether Mason's feelings toward his former commander had influenced the investigation. "Yes," Mason said. The answer seemed to surprise him. "How?" "It made me slower to believe what was in front of me." "Or more determined to punish a man you felt had disappointed you?" "No." Mason looked directly at Graham. "He was the man who taught me not to leave anyone behind. That is why I could not stay silent when he began deciding who was acceptable to leave behind." Graham's expression did not break, but for the first time, he looked away first. Mason felt no victory, only grief stripped of confusion. He no longer needed to turn Graham into a monster to condemn what he had done. He no longer needed to erase the rescue from 17 years ago, or pretend the people helped by Valor Ridge had not truly been helped. A man could carry another person out of darkness and still lose his own way afterward. Goodness was not armor. It was a practice, and it expired each time someone decided past virtue should excuse present harm. The first meeting for the new oversight program took place in a borrowed conference room above a public library. There were no television cameras and no polished launch presentation. The coffee was weak, one projector cable did not work, and Brooke Sutter spent 10 minutes explaining that a handwritten transfer note was not a legal record merely because someone had used blue ink. Elise Navarro sat beside her with a stack of veterinary protocols. Kendra Weller had reduced several months of financial investigation into a list of requirements no donor could politely misunderstand. Dana represented residential programs and reminded everyone that reform, which destroyed housing without replacing it, was merely another way of making vulnerable people pay for a leader's decisions. They called the pilot program the Open Hand Standard. The name had come from Elise. A closed hand controls, she had said. An open hand offers, receives, and can be seen. Only 5 regional organizations volunteered for the first year. That was enough. The standards required independent inspections, transparent canine transfer records, anonymous reporting channels, and strict separation between fundraising staff and anyone deciding whether an animal remained in service. Training based on deliberate agitation, fear, or forced confrontation was prohibited. Mason refused the director position. He had spent enough time around men who believed responsibility required standing in the center of everything. Instead, he became an advisor on leadership and veteran participation. He spoke with former service members about the dangerous comfort of command language, how obedience could look like healing when it merely replaced one kind of fear with another. He did not teach them to become softer. He taught them that strength without consent often became control, wearing a noble expression. Ember and Finch's adoption became final shortly before the first snow of the following winter. On the paperwork, the clerk had entered Mason as the owner. He crossed out the word and wrote guardian beside it. The clerk looked at the correction. That is not the legal category. I know. You still need to sign on the owner line. Mason signed. Some systems changed slowly. Finch had grown almost as tall as Ember, though his chest had not yet caught up with his legs. His right ear stood proudly, while the left remained tilted, as if unwilling to commit to adulthood. The comma-shaped patch beneath his right eye made him appear permanently interested in mischief. He still believed himself small enough to sleep in the towel basket. The basket had developed other opinions. One afternoon, Mason found Finch sitting on top of the crushed wicker, staring at the wall with the dignity of a king whose throne had failed its constitutional duty. Ember watched from the rug. She gave Mason a look that suggested the matter should be handled by the responsible adult. Mason looked around. Bad news, he told her. That appears to be you. Her notched ear tilted. Finch sneezed, and the basket collapsed another inch. Ember's recovery did not follow the clean rise of a line on a chart. She could sleep with her back to the door now. She allowed Mason to touch the top of her head, after first brushing her nose against his wrist. She walked through town without flattening herself whenever a stranger passed. But chains still stopped her. A truck idling too long near the house could make her stand rigid beside the window. On some mornings, she followed Mason confidently across the snow. On others, she froze at the edge of the pines and stared toward a road no one else could see inside her memory. Mason never pulled the lead. He stood beside her until she chose whether to continue or turn home. Healing, he had learned, was not a destination reached by the obedient. It was the growing certainty that refusal would not cost them love. The Open Hand Group held its first winter walk in early December. There was no stage, no ribbon, and no speech claiming one program had solved what fear, grief, and isolation had spent years creating. A dozen adults gathered at a trailhead outside Stanley with dogs in soft harnesses. Some of the people were veterans. Others were handlers, counselors, volunteers, or former residents of Valor Ridge. Raymond came carrying a thermos of black tea. Dana carried emergency contact cards and enough spare gloves to outfit a small expedition. Brooke brought her battered clipboard, despite everyone informing her that the walk was not an inspection. Everything becomes an inspection if people behave badly enough, she said. The trail passed through sunlit pines and descended toward a narrow wooden bridge over a frozen creek. Ember stopped before the first plank. Mason felt the hesitation through the lead. The bridge was safe. He had checked it that morning. The boards were dry, the railings secure, and the ice below thick enough to hold the pale winter sunlight without cracking. None of that mattered to Ember's body. Her head lowered. The muscles along her back tightened. Mason stopped beside her. He did not step ahead to show her the route. He did not shorten the lead or use a command. Other walkers waited behind them. No one complained. Then Finch appeared carrying a pine branch nearly as long as Mason was tall. The branch struck Dana's boot, brushed Raymond's coat, and became wedged between the bridge railings. Finch pulled. The branch remained loyal to the bridge. Finch pulled harder, his back feet sliding across the snow. When the branch still refused to cooperate, he stopped and stared at it with the wounded expression of a warrior betrayed by his own weapon. Someone laughed. Then another person did. The tension loosened without disappearing. Ember turned her head toward Finch and released a low huff. It was not quite laughter, but it carried the exhausted affection of a mother who had accepted that dignity had skipped a generation. Finch abandoned the branch and trotted across the bridge. Ember watched him reach the other side. Then she placed one paw on the first board. Mason remained behind her. She took another step, then another. By the time she reached the center, the lead hung completely loose. Mason followed, not because he had surrendered leadership, because this time, the direction belonged to her. A letter from Graham arrived 2 weeks later. The envelope carried the return address of the facility where he was being held, while the remaining legal proceedings continued. Mason placed it on the kitchen table. For most of the evening, he worked around it. He repaired a weather radio, fed the dogs, stacked wood, and made coffee he forgot to drink. Finch tried to take the envelope once. Mason rescued it before the legal system acquired bite marks. After dark, he opened it. Graham's handwriting remained controlled and narrow. The letter contained no complete apology. He wrote that Valor Ridge would have failed without Granite Passage. He insisted that Mason now enjoyed the moral comfort of judging choices he had never been forced to make. He believed time would show that leadership was often the art of choosing which numbers could not be saved together. Near the end, he wrote, "One day, you may find yourself responsible for more lives than your principles can comfortably hold." Mason read the line twice. Months earlier, it might have angered him. Now it only made him tired. Graham still believed the failure had been arithmetic. Too many needs, too little money, an impossible balance. He had never understood that the deepest failure came earlier, when he stopped allowing anyone else to question which lives entered the calculation. Mason did not burn the letter. He did not answer. He placed it inside the case file beside the financial records, transport schedules, and signed statements. Not as proof that Graham had always been evil, but as evidence that a person could once do something brave and later use the memory of that courage to avoid seeing himself clearly. Outside, new snow covered the yard. Ember stood near the porch, looking toward the road. Finch raced past her with one of Mason's black mechanic gloves in his mouth, tail high, proud as a soldier carrying the captured flag of an enemy nation. "Mason's property," Mason called. Finch accelerated. Ember watched the puppy disappear around the side of the house. Then she looked toward the road once more. For a moment, Mason wondered whether she was remembering the overlook, the blanket, or the vehicle that had left her there. Perhaps she remembered all of it. Perhaps memory did not need to become smaller for life to grow around it. Mason stepped down from the porch. Ember turned away from the road and walked toward him. She touched her nose to his wrist. Then she continued past, following Finch's tracks through the snow. Mason followed both dogs into the bright winter evening. Loyalty, he understood now, wasn't continuing behind someone simply because they had once led you out of darkness. Sometimes loyalty meant returning for those still trapped there. Sometimes it meant holding a door open without deciding who must walk through it. And sometimes it meant loving what a person had once been, while finding the courage not to follow what they had become. Sometimes the hardest person to question is the one who once saved us. Mason learned that gratitude can honor the past without surrendering the conscience God gave us for today. True loyalty doesn't protect wrongdoing. It keeps the door open for those who were forgotten and finds the courage to walk a better road. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and what you knew was right? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and join us for more stories of courage, animals, and second chances. May you be given wisdom for every difficult choice and peace after you make it.